Chapter 24. What are you doing here? On the morning of October 21st, the under-13 Fugees piled into the white YMCA bus in the parking lot of the Clarkston Public Library and set out for Athens to take on the Athens United Gold Valiants. It was a 1.5-hour drive, so the boys settled in. Tracy drove the bus while Luma led the way in her yellow Volkswagen. The drive took them out of the bustle of Atlanta and through small towns in the Georgia countryside. Luma queued up her iPod, which was plugged into her car stereo, and turned up the music. For the first time in a long while, she was able to daydream. Near Monroe, Georgia, about an hour east of Atlanta, Luma was cruising in the right-hand lane when she looked out the driver's side window and saw a Georgia State Police car riding alongside of her. Luma looked at her speedometer. She wasn't speeding. A moment later, the trooper eased his cruiser behind Luma's Volkswagen and turned on his flashing lights. The brake light, Luma thought. The light had been on a long list of personal errands Luma had put off to deal with her team and her players' families. She eased onto the shoulder and began to slow, with the trooper behind her. The bus carrying the team continued on. Luma looked at her watch. If this didn't take too long, she could still get to Athens in time for a full warm-up. The officer approached and asked for Luma's license, then disappeared for a moment into his car. By now, the kids in the bus were getting agitated. Some of the boys had seen Luma get pulled over through the rear window of the bus. They asked Tracy what was happening. She wasn't certain, but reassured them that Luma would be on her way shortly. Meanwhile, the officer approached Luma's car again. Her license had been suspended, he informed her, and ordered her out of the car. Luma was puzzled. There's no reason her license should have been suspended. She had been ticketed only once in recent memory for an expired registration, and she had paid the fine on time. The trooper had no way of looking into that on a weekend. He only knew what the computer told him. Under Georgia law, he said, he had to arrest her. The trooper ordered Luma to turn around and put her hands behind her back. She did, and a moment later felt the cold steel of the officer's handcuffs on her wrists. By now, Tracy had turned the bus around and was pulling onto the shoulder behind the cop's cruiser. Luma asked that she be allowed to give the team's players' cards to the bus driver to the team who could go ahead to the game without her, and pleaded with the officer to remove the handcuffs while they were in front of the kids. "If you promise not to hit me," he said, a joke. Luma didn't laugh. The officer obliged. Luma took the player cards to Tracy. The referee would need them to verify the identities and ages of the players. Then she addressed her players. She told them she wouldn't be able to make the game. She told them they knew what to do. She expected them to win without her. Luma had hoped to reassure the Fugees, but her voice was shaking. The Fugees sat uneasily on the bus. Several had seen or heard of family members getting carted off, or worse, by police for the pettiest of offenses. Santino Jerke's uncle had been shot and killed in front of him by uniformed Sudanese government soldiers for stealing a chicken. Shahir Anwar's family had been hounded by Taliban soldiers because his mother ran a school for girls. The boys' coach and guide through the unfamiliar world where their families had settled was getting hauled off by the police. Some of the boys began to cry. Josiah Sadie, the librarian forward and team leader, was sitting in the last row. As the bus pulled back onto the highway, he turned around and looked through the rear window to see Luma getting into the back seat of the police cruiser. In hushed tones, Josiah told his roommate sitting near him what he had seen. Coach Luma was in the police car. She was going to jail. The Fugees unloaded from the team bus in the parking lot of the Athens United Soccer Club a little more than half an hour later. David Anderson, the Valiants coach, saw their faces and got excited. The Valiants had been beating their opponents badly, and Anderson wanted a challenge. Anderson knew next to nothing about the Fugees when they showed up, but at a glance he assumed they were a notch above the typical local team. "You see certain nationalities," said Anderson, "and you say, these kids can play." But he also noted one important absence. Where's their coach, he wondered. The Walton County Jail was a dull structure surrounded by a tangle of razor wire that ran along a chain-link fence and glistened in the sunlight. Inside, the trooper who had arrested Luma was handing her over to the custody of the Walton County Sheriff's Department. A clerk asked her to state her name. "Luma," she said. "How do you spell that?" the clerk asked. "Don't bother," the trooper said, sliding her driver's license to the clerk. The clerk noticed Luma's middle initial, H, and asked what it stood for. "Hassan," Luma said. The clerk cast a knowing glance at the arresting officer. "Hassan," she said. "Where's that from?" "Jordan," said Luma. "It's Arab?" the clerk asked. "What are you doing here?" Luma started to explain that she was on her way to a soccer game when she had been pulled over, but she was cut off. "What are you doing here in the United States?" she was asked. Luma didn't respond. It was time to get fingerprinted. When she had registered for the Immigration and Naturalization Service upon filing her green card application, Luma had been fingerprinted. Her fingers were placed on an ink pad and carefully rolled over the card beneath. The woman at the Walton County Jail had a different approach. She grabbed Luma's hand, inked her fingertips, and then slammed her hand down on the counter. For the first time, Luma began to feel afraid. Her wallet and sweatshirt were taken from her. The bailiff told Luma she couldn't wear the sweatshirt in jail because it might be contaminated with lice. Bail was set at $759.50, and Luma was escorted into a holding cell with a group of women who looked no happier to be there than she was. By now, Dave Anderson had learned that the Fuji's coach had been held up en route to the game, and he was curious to see how the team would fare without help from the sideline. Tracy did her best to encourage the boys, but she was not a soccer coach. The boys divvied up their positions and took the field. Robin and Edouard DeCory were unaware of the challenge that awaited them. It took the Valiants less than 3 minutes to score their first goal. 2 minutes later, they scored again. Anderson could tell something was amiss. He knew from what he'd seen in the warm-ups that the Fugees could play, and yet on the field they looked lost. They were arguing with one another and giving Eldon, the goalie, a hard time. A few minutes later, the Valiants scored their third goal. The first half was not over yet. Anderson scanned the Fugees' half of the field. Their heads had begun to drop. It was a sign he'd come to known well from the Valiants' opponents. "Oh man," Anderson thought, "they're done." The Valiants scored again and again. At the half, they led 5-0. When the Valiants came to the bench, Anderson told them he would be switching them up in the second half. The forwards would move to defense, and the defenders would play offense. They understood why. The game was getting out of hand, but they were puzzled, unable to understand how a group of kids who seemed so talented in warm-ups could play so badly. The Fuji spent halftime fighting over who would play where. Tiny Kenjin volunteered to replace Eldon at keeper, a move his teammates roundly rejected, even as they agreed a change was needed in the net. Half the team wanted Bienda on defense when he could clear the ball with his powerful kick. The other half wanted him at forward. Jeremiah would anchor the middle. Mafode, usually the weaker of the two keepers, would keep Eldon's place in the net. As the second half began, Anderson watched to see how the Fugees would respond. A few minutes in, he noticed something. Their chins were up. They were going after the ball. The Valiants managed to blast a shot low to the left. Heavy-set Mafadoy, whose vertical jump was perhaps 3 inches, dove and made the stop. A moment later, Jeremiah chased down a free ball and, attempting to clear it, blasted it into Valiant's midsection with unexpected force. The player collapsed on the ground in pain and had to come out of the game. The Fugees hadn't caved. Midway through the second half, the score was still 5-0, and the Fugees were called for a foul in the box for slide tackling from behind. The Valiants would have a penalty shot. Mafode took his place in goal. With his stubby legs and broad waist supporting a big-barreled chest, Mafode appeared more like a fixture in goal than a potentially mobile obstacle. He looked vulnerable and almost lonely. Mafode shook out his arms and put his hands on his knees and stared into the narrowing eyes of the Valiant sharpshooter and a shiny black and gold before him. The Valiant's parents cheered the shooter on, while the Fugees players encouraged Mafadoy with less confidence. There wasn't much difference, after all, between a 5 and a 6 goal lead. The Valiant shooter surveyed the open net in front of him. He stepped toward the ball, flung his leg forward, and connected, firing a low, fast shot to the goalie's right. Mafode Johnway had made his decision. As the Valiants player made contact with the ball, Mafode tipped to his right and began to fall. He extended his arms over his head and landed on the ground, stretched out and parallel with the crossbar. There was a thud, then a moment's pause as Mafode and his teammates realized the ball had stopped in his gray padded goalie gloves and stayed there, just in front of the end line. A save. The Fugees erupted in cheers and surrounded Mafode. A few minutes later, the referee blew the whistle 3 times. The final score was 5-0. Valiants. The Fugees hadn't given up a goal in the second half. They'd fought and held their own. Sitting in the Walton County Jail, Luma had lost all track of time. Eventually her thoughts turned to Amon, her family, and especially her late grandmother, who had always told her as a child that things happened for a reason. What was the reason for this, Luma wondered. Was it a warning that she should change her middle name in America so she wasn't harassed? That she should pay more attention to her own life by making sure she took care of things like burned out brake lights? Luma heard her name being called. She stepped into the room with a view of the clerk's counter where she saw Tracy signing papers and sliding them back to the clerk, then handing over cash for bail, $759.50 in exact change. A moment later, a door opened and Luma was free to go. She walked out of the building and directly onto the team bus parked in front of the Walton County Jail. Lumen asked about the store and got the bad news. The Fugees had lost 5-0. This was my fault, and I had no excuse for not being there, she told her players. I should have been there, and I wasn't, and the way it happened probably messed you guys up. Mafade stopped a penalty kick, someone said. It was a really hard team, coach, said Edouard Decory. Were they better than you? Luma asked. No, the Fuji shouted in response. Come on, guys, were they? No, coach, said Robin, Edouard's little brother. If you were there, we were going to beat them. Back in Clarkston that night, Luma got a call from the 9-year-old brother of Grace Balagamir, a midfielder for the under-13s. The boy's mother had gone to the hospital with his older brother and his little sister to visit a friend who had just had a baby. The boy was at home with his twin brother in Grasse, but he was unhappy. I'm sad, he told Luma. Why are you sad, he said. I'm scared to be alone, he said. Oh, quit it, Luma said. Luma hung up the phone and decided she had an errand to run. She drove to the grocery store and picked up some sweet rolls, then headed over to the boy's apartment. When she arrived, he was in his bedroom with the door closed. Luma knocked, but the boy wouldn't answer. She coaxed him out, eventually with the sweet rolls. The two sat and talked. I just had a bad day, he said. Luma smiled. Do you want to hear about a bad day, she said. Yeah. Luma told him everything. The cops, the jail, how she missed Grass's soccer game. He didn't buy any of it. Coach, don't lie, he said. You would never go to jail. No, I went, as Grass. If you were in jail, you wouldn't be here, he said. No. Tracy paid to get me out, Luma said. How much? Enough for 500 ice creams. If you pay 500 ice creams, you can come out of jail, he asked. Luma started to explain how bail worked, but then she caught herself, finally understanding the boy's confusion. The Balagamir's father was still locked up in Makala, the notorious central prison in Kinshasa. The government of the Democratic Republic of Congo had issued no word on when or if he would be released.